My name is Leonard Carver. I am 73 years old, and I live in the same modest two-story house on the edge of Omaha, where my late wife and I raised our only son. The neighborhood has changed many times over the years, with families coming and going, lawns growing wild where once the grass was neatly cut, children disappearing into the world as quickly as they had once filled the streets with their shouts. But the house itself has remained more or less the same, a square of faded brick with creaking floorboards and a porch that still groans when you put your weight on it. I retired from teaching nearly a decade ago, after more than 40 years of standing in front of classrooms, chalk in hand, explaining the same equations and passages of literature to generation after generation of restless students. Those years were not glamorous. They were not marked by triumphs worthy of history books, yet they gave me a sense of purpose, a rhythm, and above all, a conviction that what I did mattered in some quiet way. When my wife, Martha, passed away 6 years ago from cancer that spread too quickly for doctors to stop, that rhythm collapsed. The house turned unbearably silent, the morning rituals I had taken for granted, her humming in the kitchen, her hand brushing against my sleeve when she passed behind my chair, her habit of setting my coffee mug a little closer to me than necessary, as if I might forget where it was, disappeared, leaving behind a hollowness I could not at first endure. During those first months of widowhood, I tried to maintain the appearance of normality. I mowed the lawn. I visited the library. I bought groceries with the same list Martha once used, though I never managed to cook in her way and often let vegetables rot in the crisper drawer. I saw my son Daniel occasionally, usually when he had time between work shifts or when he needed a small loan to cover a bill that had somehow slipped his mind. He was in his 30s then, single, unsettled, and I tried not to judge him harshly. Life, I told myself, was different for his generation, more unstable, filled with precarious jobs and uncertain futures. And who was I, a man with a pension and a paid-off mortgage, to look down on him? What I longed for, more than stability or repayment, was company. I believed, perhaps naively, that losing his mother would draw him closer to me, that grief would stitch us together, but instead it seemed to unmoor him further. He spoke of schemes that never materialized, of moving to new cities, of starting businesses that ended after 2 weeks of enthusiasm. And yet, despite his restlessness, he never really left. One day he simply appeared at my door with 2 duffel bags, said his lease was over, his job had ended, and he needed a place to stay until he got back on his feet. I opened the door without hesitation. A father does not turn his child away, not even a grown child, with lines of disappointment already etching his face. So Daniel stayed, at first just in the guest room, then slowly spreading across the house like ivy that climbs a wall unnoticed, until one day the bricks are hidden. His sneakers crowded the hallway, his hoodies occupied half the coat closet, and his voice on the phone carried late into the night from the living room, where he sprawled with his laptop. At the beginning, I was glad of the noise, glad to hear footsteps, to share meals, to believe the house had not become a tomb. I told neighbors proudly that my son had moved back, that it would be good for both of us, 2 men supporting each other through the long nights of absence. But as months turned to years, I began to feel a shift in the balance. Where once I had been the father providing guidance, I now felt like an unwelcome guest in my own rooms, tiptoeing around his moods, measuring my words, waiting for the rare days when he showed something like gratitude. I would wake before dawn, as old men often do, with sleep cut short by aches in the joints and a restless mind. The kitchen would be mine alone in those hours, the quiet broken only by the hiss of the kettle and the ticking of the clock that still hung above the pantry door, its hands faithfully circling, though sometimes I wondered if time itself had not stopped in that house when Martha died. I brewed my coffee, always a little too bitter, and sat at the table trying to read the newspaper, but finding myself staring instead at the empty chair across from me. When Daniel eventually emerged, it was rarely with a good morning. He moved like someone irritated by light itself, squinting at the brightness of day, pulling milk from the fridge without asking if I wanted any, leaving crumbs across the counter as if the kitchen were a hotel lobby and I its attendant. I excused it as youth, though he was no youth any longer, and told myself that his struggles were heavy enough without me adding reproaches. Still, there were moments when the loneliness pressed so tightly that I spoke aloud, just to hear another human voice. I would tell him stories of the school where I worked, of former students who had written to me after years of silence to say they remembered something I had once said. Daniel listened half-heartedly, scrolling on his phone, nodding absently, and I clung to those nods as though they meant understanding. I wanted to believe that beneath his detachment was affection, that perhaps he did not know how to show it, or that grief had hardened him in ways I could not yet see. A father's love is stubborn. It persists even when logic advises surrender. With each passing season, the pattern deepened. Daniel contributed little to the household, insisting that he was between opportunities, that the economy was rigged, that people of his age could not hope for the security I had enjoyed. I covered the bills without complaint, not because I had endless means. My pension was modest, and the savings Martha and I had built were not infinite, but because I told myself it was temporary. What is a year or two in the span of a lifetime? Yet behind that rationalization was another truth, darker and harder to admit. I was afraid of being alone. I feared the silence of evenings, with only the television murmuring to me, feared the holidays without family at the table, feared the thought that my son might vanish and never come back. So I endured his indifference, even his occasional sharp words, clinging to the idea that having him under the same roof was better than emptiness. As time wore on, I began to feel the subtle erosion of dignity. It is not always one great blow that diminishes a man, but a series of small humiliations that accumulate like dust in the corners. A laugh at my expense when I forgot where I put the remote, a sigh of annoyance when I asked for help carrying groceries, a muttered comment that teaching children had been a waste compared to real jobs. These remarks cut more deeply than he knew, not because I believed them, but because they came from the mouth of the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, the boy whose drawings I had pinned proudly to the refrigerator, the boy for whom I had worked extra tutoring sessions to afford a new bicycle. Love transforms those small wounds into scars that ache long after the words have faded. I often walked the neighborhood in the evenings, leaning on my cane, passing houses glowing with warm light, and the shadows of families moving within. Sometimes I heard laughter drifting from porches, the clink of glasses, the shriek of children playing tag, and I felt both envy and shame. Envy that others seemed to retain what I had lost. Shame that I could not mend what had broken between Daniel and me. At church gatherings, when people asked after my son, I answered too quickly, saying he was fine, that he was searching for new work, that he was still young and full of possibilities. They accepted my words politely, perhaps suspecting more than I admitted, but I could not bear to confess the truth, that my son was adrift, and I was powerless to anchor him. The weight of years has a way of bending the back and narrowing the future until each day resembles the last. Yet even as my steps grew slower, my hope lingered. I believed there might come a morning when Daniel would sit with me at the table, pour me coffee without being asked, and speak not as a resentful tenant, but as a son who remembered he was loved. That fragile hope, irrational as it was, sustained me. It was the thread that tied me to the life remaining, the thought that redemption, however small, might arrive unexpectedly. And so, in this long, quiet introduction to what would follow, I remained a father, holding to his belief in family, blind perhaps to how far that faith could be tested, but unwilling to relinquish it, even as the world around me hinted that the bond between us had already begun to decay beyond repair. It began with words that at first I dismissed as little more than irritation, the kind of sharp remark people make when they are frustrated with themselves and redirect that frustration toward whoever happens to be nearest. But in time, I realized they carried something more deliberate, something cruel that was meant to settle into me like poison. Daniel had been out of work for several months, spending his days drifting between the couch and the computer, scrolling through endless lists of jobs he never applied to, muttering about the unfairness of the world, about how corporations preyed on the weak, about how people of his age were doomed to struggle until they broke. I listened as patiently as I could, offering suggestions, reminding him of his own abilities, telling him that he had once been admired by teachers for his intelligence, that there was no reason he could not stand on his own feet. But instead of encouragement, my words seemed to ignite his resentment. And he began to say things that startled me not for their volume, but for their coldness. "You had it easy," he snapped one morning while rummaging in the refrigerator. "You lived in some golden age where teaching kids gave you a pension and security. You don't know what it's like for us now. You don't deserve half of what you got." He closed the fridge door with a slam and walked away before I could respond, leaving me with the uneasy sense that he had just drawn a line between us that had never existed before. At first I told myself it was only stress. I knew financial strain could twist even gentle souls, and Daniel was not gentle by nature. But over the following weeks, the comments repeated themselves, growing sharper, bolder, until they became less like complaints and more like accusations. He said I had been selfish for retiring when I did, that I should still be working to provide not only for myself but for him as well, that my pension and savings were wasted on one old man who barely eats. I laughed nervously the first time he said it, thinking it was a joke in poor taste, but his face was grave, his eyes narrowed, and the silence that followed was heavier than any jest. "You want food," he said once, "then you should earn it like everyone else." Nothing is free, not even for you. The words were absurd. What father has to earn the right to eat in his own house? Yet they lodged in my chest with a sting I could not ignore. The turning point came one evening when I returned from the church hall, where I had been helping to sort donated clothing. It was a small volunteer effort I clung to because it gave me the feeling that I was still useful to someone, still a part of the world beyond the walls of my house. I stepped inside, weary but content, only to hear the sound of metal scraping against metal in the kitchen. At first I thought he was fixing something, but when I walked in, I froze. Daniel was crouched before the refrigerator, attaching a heavy padlock. Through a steel hasp he had screwed directly into the door. I stared at him in disbelief, the absurdity of the scene so great that for a moment I thought I must be dreaming. "What on earth are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up with an expression that was part amusement, part challenge. "From now on," he said evenly, "this is mine. You want something out of here, you earn it." I felt the blood rush to my face. "This is my house," I protested. "That refrigerator was bought with my money. Every item inside it I paid for. How dare you?" He interrupted me with a raised hand, a gesture as if silencing a student who had spoken out of turn. "And whose money keeps paying the electricity?" he asked. "Yours, right? Well, then it's your choice to keep the fridge running for me. If you want anything in it, you can pay me back. Maybe mow the lawn. Maybe give me a little cash. No more freeloading, old man." The last words cut so deep, I almost staggered. In my entire life, after decades of providing for him, of feeding him, clothing him, supporting his education, sacrificing for his comfort, to be called a freeloader in my own kitchen by my own son was a humiliation so sharp I could barely find words. I remember standing there, gripping the edge of the counter for balance, watching as he snapped the lock shut and slipped the key into his pocket. His movements were casual, as though what he was doing was not grotesque, not an inversion of every natural bond between parent and child, but something as ordinary as replacing a light bulb. "You can't be serious," I whispered. He shrugged. "Perfectly serious. This way you'll learn to appreciate things. You've had it too easy, Dad. All these years you just had food appear in front of you, never worrying about what it costs, never thinking about how hard it is to get by. Maybe now you'll get it." I wanted to shout, to rip the lock from the door, to strike him even, though I had never raised a hand to him in his life. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was shock, perhaps fear of escalating the situation into violence, or perhaps it was the exhaustion of age that makes one retreat rather than advance. I simply turned and walked out of the kitchen, my hands shaking, my throat dry. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall where Martha's photograph hung. I could almost hear her voice telling me to be patient, to try to reach him with kindness. But another part of me, darker and more honest, told me that something had broken between us that might never be repaired. That night, I ate a piece of stale bread I had kept in a tin and drank tap water, the humiliation burning worse than hunger. The padlock gleamed each time I passed the kitchen, mocking me with its presence. I lay awake wondering how it had come to this, how my own flesh and blood had turned my home into a place where I was treated like an intruder. And though I did not yet know it, that lock would not only change the rhythm of my days, but set into motion a chain of events that neither of us could control, a descent into cruelty and irony so sharp that it would one day leave me alive and him destroyed by his own hand. At first I thought the padlock might be a passing whim, a gesture of anger that would dissolve once he realized how absurd it was. But days went by, and the heavy steel remained fixed to the refrigerator door like a sentinel of humiliation. And with each morning I awoke to find it still there. The situation felt less like an outburst and more like a new law governing my existence. The first time I asked for food, it was not even out of desperation, but more out of curiosity, to test whether he truly meant what he had said. It was late morning. I had been working in the garden pulling weeds, the sun already hot on my shoulders, and I came in thirsty and weak, craving something cold and fresh. I asked if I could have some juice, my voice calm, almost polite. Daniel looked up from the couch, where he was sprawled, and smirked. "Juice?" he repeated. "What are you offering for it?" I laughed nervously, thinking again it might be a joke, but his stare was unyielding. "You want something from my fridge? You earn it. Maybe give me $10, or do some work around here that's worth $10. Otherwise, there's bread on the counter." On the counter lay 2 slices of cheap white bread, already drying at the edges, a mockery of a meal. I felt something collapse in me, some remnant of dignity, as I took the bread and ate it dry, swallowing against a lump of shame in my throat, while he watched with satisfaction, as though he had proved a point. The pattern continued. He would sit eating from cartons of takeout or bowls of cereal while I waited, stomach churning, too proud to beg but too hungry to ignore the scent. When he felt generous, he would toss me leftovers, always with a remark that stung. "Don't say I never give you anything," or "You've got to learn to live within your means." Once, when I tried to protest that they were my means, that every cent in that house came from me, he cut me short with a sneer. "Yeah, but you're too old to know what to do with it. Money rots in your hands. At least I spend it while it matters." That night he slid a plate across the table, containing nothing but a few boiled potatoes, cold and rubbery, and told me to be grateful. I ate them in silence, knowing that if I refused, I would have nothing at all. The indignities multiplied in ways both petty and profound. He began referring to the kitchen as his space, reminding me that if I wanted anything from it, I should knock first, as though I were a tenant renting a room rather than the owner of the house. He moved my chair from its usual place at the table and replaced it with a stool, saying that the chair creaked too much under my weight. When I asked for milk for my tea, he poured half a cup and then drank the rest slowly in front of me, never breaking eye contact. These small acts of cruelty chipped away at me more effectively than a single violent strike would have, because they came not from a stranger or an enemy, but from the boy I had once carried in my arms. To be mocked by him, to see pleasure in his eyes when I bent to his rules, was like being told that my love had been a lifelong mistake. I tried to resist in quiet ways. I bought a small supply of canned goods and hid them in my room, eating them sparingly at night when the hunger grew unbearable. Once he discovered a tin of beans under my bed and stormed into my room, waving it in the air like contraband. "So you're stealing from me now?" he shouted. I answered calmly that I had bought it with my own money. But he laughed, saying, "Your money is my money as long as you live under my roof." I wanted to tell him it was my roof, my house, my decades of work that had secured it, but the words stuck in my throat, strangled by the knowledge that logic no longer mattered. He had rewritten the rules of our life, and in those rules, I was no longer father, but supplicant. The neighbors began to notice the change in my appearance. I had lost weight, my clothes hung looser, and more than once I caught concerned glances when I walked to the mailbox. A kind woman down the street asked if I was all right, if I needed help with shopping. And though my heart ached to tell her the truth, I heard my own voice answer with the rehearsed lie, "I'm fine, just watching my diet." Pride, or perhaps shame, kept me silent. To admit what was happening would be to confess not only his cruelty, but my own failure, my inability to stop it, my complicity in enduring it. What haunted me most was the memory of all the meals I had given him as a child, the hours Martha and I had spent making sure he was fed even when money was scarce, the nights I worked late tutoring to afford the little luxuries he wanted. I remembered him at 5, grinning with his face smeared in jam, at 12, demanding seconds of the stew I made, at 17, sulking at the table, but eating nonetheless. Food had always been the language of our care, the proof that we provided, that we loved. Now he used that same language as a weapon, turning nourishment into humiliation each withheld meal. A reminder that I was at his mercy. I lay awake many nights, stomach hollow, wondering whether this was some twisted lesson he thought he was teaching me, or whether he truly believed his own cruelty was justified. Perhaps he had convinced himself that he was instilling toughness, that by denying me comfort, he was balancing scales of history in which I had supposedly had too much. But in the stillness of night, when I heard him pacing the hall or opening another bottle, I suspected the truth was simpler and darker. He enjoyed it, the power, the reversal, the sight of his old father reduced to begging. It gave him a sense of control he had never managed to find elsewhere. The escalation reached its most painful point one afternoon, when I fainted in the yard. I had been raking leaves, pushing myself harder than I should have in the heat. And when I came inside, dizzy and trembling, I asked him for water from the fridge. He laughed and said, "Earn it," then turned back to the television. I stumbled to the sink and drank tap water, but the humiliation pressed harder than the thirst. Later, when I told him I felt ill, he said, "Maybe that will teach you to take better care of yourself. Don't expect me to bail you out every time. Bail me out in my own home." I went to bed that night with a pain in my chest that felt less like illness and more like heartbreak. By then, the house no longer felt like a refuge, but a prison. Every room tainted by his scorn, every mealtime an exercise in degradation. The padlock gleamed each time I passed it, not just a barrier to food, but a symbol of my captivity, a reminder that I was no longer master of my own life, but subject to the whims of my son. And though I endured, swallowing both hunger and pride, a part of me began to sense that something had shifted permanently, that the cruelty would not stop on its own, that this was not a phase, but the beginning of something that could only deepen until one of us broke. It was during the 3rd month of living under that strange new tyranny that the balance between us shifted in a way I had not foreseen, because while he believed he was the jailer and I the prisoner, it became gradually clear that he was trapping himself in the same cage he had locked around me. At first I did not notice it. Hunger dulls the eyes, and fatigue makes one blind to what is directly before him. But soon I began to see that Daniel himself was not eating well. He purchased beer and cheap bottles of vodka with what little money he scraped together, and though the refrigerator was locked, its contents began to dwindle. I heard the door open less often, and when it did, it was usually to remove another drink, not food. His meals consisted of takeout boxes when he had cash, or nothing at all when he did not. In his pride, he never admitted that he too was going hungry, that the lock had not only humiliated me, but had shackled him as well, and the irony of it weighed heavily, though at the time I did not dare voice it aloud. The pivotal moment came late one evening, when he stumbled through the front door, reeking of alcohol, and dropped his keys onto the floor. He mumbled something incoherent, then opened the fridge, staring at the near-empty shelves, and swore loudly. He pulled out a half-eaten carton of noodles and stood, swaying as if he might fall, finally throwing the carton into the trash and slamming the door shut. I sat quietly in the armchair, pretending to read, though my heart beat rapidly as I watched him. He turned and caught my gaze, his eyes bloodshot, and he said, almost spitting, "See, this is what you've done to me. All my money goes to keeping you here, and what do I get? Nothing." His words slurred, but the bitterness was sharp enough. Before I could answer, he pointed at me with a trembling finger. "You think you're the victim, but you're sucking me dry. If you weren't here, I'd be fine." He staggered into his room and slammed the door, leaving me staring at the cold glow of the refrigerator light, still seeping through the crack. That night I realized something had shifted, because the man who had sought to control me through food was himself, controlled by his addiction and his pride, and he was too blind to admit that he was falling into the same pit he had dug. In the following days, I saw the consequences more clearly. He slept late, sometimes until noon, and when he emerged, his hands shook so badly he had to grip the counter for support. He spoke less, except to mutter complaints, and his anger grew sharper whenever I mentioned groceries. Once, when I suggested we go together to the store, he snapped that I wanted to embarrass him in front of the neighbors, that everyone would see he could not provide for himself. So the refrigerator stayed locked, even though there was almost nothing inside it, a monument not to control, but to his stubborn refusal to admit defeat. I, on the other hand, began to adapt in small, desperate ways. The church where I volunteered served meals twice a week, and I stayed after my duties to eat quietly in the corner. A neighbor, kind and unsuspecting, once gave me a bag of apples from her tree, and I kept them hidden in a drawer like treasures. I grew used to surviving on scraps, but in those meager acts, I found a strange kind of resilience. For the first time, I understood that I did not need him as much as he wanted me to believe, that his cruelty had forced me to rediscover my own resourcefulness. That realization did not free me completely, but it planted a seed that began to grow. One afternoon, I returned from the church with a small sack of donated rolls, only to find Daniel sitting on the floor by the refrigerator, his back against the counter, the lock hanging untouched. His face was pale, his lips dry, and his breath smelled sour with alcohol and hunger. He looked up at me with hollow eyes and muttered, "There's nothing left." For a moment I felt pity so intense it nearly broke me, because he looked less like a grown man and more like the boy he had once been, lost and needy. But then I remembered the months of humiliation, the bread tossed to me like scraps, the laughter when I begged for water, and the pity turned to something colder. Not hatred, but a recognition that his fate was no longer mine to carry. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of the turning point. Until then, I had endured, telling myself that perhaps he would change, that perhaps kindness or patience would restore the bond between us. But now I saw that he was unraveling, that the lock on the fridge was not only a chain around my dignity, but a noose around his own survival. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind, not yet as a wish, but as an inevitability, that he might not survive this spiral, that his cruelty would consume him faster than it consumed me. And though the thought horrified me, it also brought a flicker of something I had not felt in a long time, the sense that I might outlast him, that I might be the one left standing when his pride and hunger finally destroyed him. In the weeks that followed the night, he slumped at the refrigerator and blamed me for the emptiness inside it. The cruelty stopped pretending to be a lesson and turned into a system, a regimen he administered with the dry zeal of a petty tyrant who has finally found a province small enough to rule, because he began to expand the borders of what he controlled, until ordinary conveniences felt like luxuries he could revoke at will. And I understood with a sinking clarity that hunger was only the first instrument he had chosen, not the last. He took my bank card for safekeeping and returned it once with a lecture about scams and old men who fall for them, then kept it indefinitely, claiming that online payments were confusing and that he, being modern, would handle them. And when I protested, he laughed and told me I should be grateful my bills were paid at all, given how little I contributed to the common good, which was an astonishing accusation to hear while standing on the same floors my pension had kept beneath our feet. He canceled the newspaper without telling me, explaining that the world made me upset and that he was protecting my blood pressure, replaced the front door lock, and kept the spare key on his own ring so that, as he put it, he could monitor coming and going. And he began screening my phone calls, telling anyone who asked for me that I was resting, that I had been confused lately, that I tired easily, all the while watching my face to measure how deeply the humiliation landed, as if that measurement was the point of the exercise and not the story he told others. He started selling small things that had once felt like fixtures in the house, testing boundaries the way a thief tests a window. First, the old radio I kept in the garage because it reminded me of my father, then a set of tools Martha had given me for our 10th anniversary, then a box of vinyl records that still smelled faintly of the living room where we had danced on weeknights after the dishes were done, and when I noticed their absence, he shrugged and said we had to liquidate clutter, that minimalism was good for the soul, that he had gotten a decent price at a place on the edge of town, and besides, I never used any of it. A laminated card from a payday lender showed up on the hall table like an unwelcome guest, and I realized he had debts I had not known about, obligations that snapped at his heels like dogs he could not outrun. And suddenly, his lectures about responsibility sounded like the speeches a gambler gives to the mirror after losing the last of his luck. He began to carry himself with the furtive energy of a man who expects a knock at the door, and if the knock comes, plans to blame the person closest to him. And I saw with terrible certainty that whatever he had told himself about teaching me a lesson was only camouflage for a hunger different from mine, a hunger for money and power and absolution for his own failures. He tried to enlist the world in his narrative, dressing his control in the garments of care so that if I resisted, it would look like ingratitude. And one afternoon, a woman from a county office called in response to a concerned report and asked if she could stop by. And when she arrived, Daniel spoke for me with a tenderness so counterfeit I almost admired the workmanship, telling her that I sometimes forgot the stove, that I mixed up my pills, that I got disoriented and wandered. And I watched. The woman's eyes flicked to my hands for tremors and to my shoes for scuffs from imagined wandering. And I told her calmly that I had taught teenagers for 40 years and knew the difference between forgetting a name and being unfit to live. And I showed her my neatly sorted medications and the notes I kept and the phone numbers I had written by the landline in my own careful script. And I saw the briefest light of recognition in her face, as if she understood the game being played. But she left me a pamphlet anyway, and a gentle warning that if anyone felt unsafe, they should call. That night, Daniel accused me of performing for her and said I had embarrassed him by insisting I could manage on my own. And I realized that his picture of the future involved my signature beneath a power of attorney he could flourish at the bank whenever creditors grew too loud, and that he had mistaken the patience of my fatherhood for a permanent surrender. The refrigerator, meanwhile, became something more than an appliance. It was a shrine to his delusion and a mirror of his decline, because he added not only the padlock, but a chain he looped through the handle, and a second hasp he screwed into the side panel where the enamel chipped under his clumsy drill. And he wore the keys around his neck as if they were a badge, and yet the contents diminished until the ritual of locking it resembled a guard pacing in front of an empty vault. He bragged to a friend on the phone about intermittent fasting and discipline, claimed that skipping meals sharpened the mind, poured vodka into a tumbler he called his evening protein, and soon his belt cinched a notch tighter while his face thinned and his eyes took on the brittle brightness of someone who has pushed his body into a corner it cannot retreat from. He would eat only when he felt he had made me suffer first, portioning out to me a scoop of rice like an overseer measuring rations, and then, as if to prove a principle, leaving himself with nothing but a cigarette and a glare, and I could feel the house itself becoming an accomplice, the floors creaking under our careful movements like an old witness, trying to remember which of us had started the quarrel. I tried to carve out small territories of autonomy the way prisoners braid rope from threads, and I learned to eat before I came home on church days, to pocket a hard-boiled egg from the volunteer table and let it anchor my stomach with its small mercy, and I made quiet arrangements with a neighbor who thought she was helping me cut back on sodium, but who, in truth, was keeping me from collapse. And I hid a jar of peanut butter behind the furnace wrapped in a cloth to muffle the clink. And the first time I unscrewed the lid in the cellar and tasted the sweetness on my thumb, I felt both shame and gratitude. Shame at the secrecy and gratitude at the proof that I was not yet entirely at his mercy. When I left the house to run an errand and returned to find my room searched, drawers open, and clothes ransacked, I understood that he had smelled the faint trace of survival and wanted to extinguish it, and I spent that evening sewing the little cash I had into the hem of a coat, like a character from a war story, astonished to find that my life had gone backward into strategies I once taught my students about resistance and survival. The worse he treated me, the more he recoiled from outside eyes, as if his cruelty had made him photosensitive, and he began to insist that I not answer the door unless he was present, that I avoid the porch during daylight because the neighbors might ask questions, and he unplugged the doorbell and claimed it was broken. And on Sundays, he criticized the church as a nest of hypocrites and urged me to rest at home. But when I told him that my faith was the only steady thing left to me, he relented with a smirk and said I could go if I brought back the free bulletin for his amusement. I started keeping notes, small factual entries on lined paper that I hid in the spine of an atlas, recording times and words and actions, not because I planned to take him to court or to call the police, but because putting ink to paper turned fog into form and helped me remember that the scenes were real and not fevered inventions of an old man's wounded pride. In those pages, I admitted things I could not say aloud, that I still loved my son even as I feared him, that I was ashamed of the fear, that I had begun to imagine mornings when I woke to find the house quiet, because he had gone and taken the keys, and the lock and the chain with him, leaving behind only the groan of the fridge door opening to my hand. One evening, returning from the basement with a jar of preserved peaches a widow at church had pressed into my hands, I found him at the kitchen table with a notary he had summoned like an accomplice, papers splayed neatly as if this were a routine transaction, and he announced with a brittle cheerfulness that we were going to make things simpler, that I would sign a durable power of attorney so he could help me with all the complicated stuff, then that it was merely a formality. And the notary, a thin young man with a tie patterned like chess squares, looked at me with polite vacancy while tapping his stamp on the table. I read the first page and then the second, and felt a cold thread of recognition. This was not help. It was conquest. I pushed the papers back gently and said that any simplification could wait until I had independent counsel, and Daniel's chair scraped the floor, and the pleasant mask fell from his face, and the room filled with a silence dense enough to bend the light. After the notary left, quickly and with a muttered apology for the inconvenience, Daniel hissed that I had humiliated him, that I had chosen strangers over family, that he would remember this, and when he stormed down the hall, I knew the lines had been redrawn in darker ink. The very next day, the utilities became weapons. The thermostat nudged down until the house was cold enough to make the bones ache, the hot water turning tepid so that showers became a drill of bracing discomfort. And when I asked, he said we had to cut back, that energy prices were high, that if I wanted warmth, I could knit a sweater like the old-timers. And he laughed at the look that must have crossed my face, because I remembered the sweater Martha had knit and the way Daniel, as a boy, had curled against it in winter, breathing in her scent. He unplugged the microwave and told me radiation was bad for seniors, removed the toaster and said crumbs were a fire hazard, and slipped the batteries from the smoke detector because its periodic chirp annoyed him. And when I replaced them, he rolled his eyes and remarked that fear made people obedient. He was getting thinner, heaving himself from the couch with a breathless groan, and still he would not admit hunger. Still he jingled the keys like proofs of empire, even as the territory shrank beneath his feet. The blows kept coming in ways that were not immediately visible, but were felt like a change in atmospheric pressure. And a letter arrived addressed to me, but opened by him, stamped from the bank, thanking me for visiting a branch and updating contact information. And when I took it from his hand, his smile was too quick. And I went to the bank the next morning and learned that a man who matched his description had tried to add himself as a joint owner on my accounts with a sloppily forged letter from a clinic asserting my cognitive decline. And the manager, who remembered my yearly habit of bringing a tin of cookies to the tellers at Christmas, had declined and made a note. And I left with new passwords and the old shame that comes from having to protect yourself from blood. I walked home slowly, feeling at once lighter and older. And when I came through the door and saw his expectant face, I realized he was waiting for a fight that would justify everything he had done. And instead, I told him the manager sent greetings and that interest rates were low, and his disappointment curdled into a rage. I felt like heat on my skin, even as he turned away. By then, he had begun to lose things, not just money and weight, but simple items that once anchored him to daily life. His wallet migrating between cushions, his phone left face down on the porch railing, his keys mislaid and then found with a panic that looked like grief. And one night I woke to the sound of him rifling drawers, cursing softly, and in the morning I saw that he had replaced the lock on the fridge with a new, heavier one, as if changing hardware could compensate for the fact that he had twice fumbled the key. And I thought, with a shameful flicker of satisfaction, that the trap he was setting had begun to close on the setter. He accused me of moving his things, of playing games with him, of hiding food he swore he could smell, and I stood quietly and let his anger wash past like weather, because there was nothing I could say that would make a man in that state trust the truth. And besides, exhaustion had taught me that arguments are a luxury for the fed. Yet even as the cruelty swelled, there were moments that startled me with their strange tenderness. Brief flashes when he looked at me and I saw not the tyrant of the kitchen, but the child who used to stand at the sink and blow soap bubbles towards the ceiling, and once he asked, very softly, whether I thought Martha had been proud of him, and before I could answer, he laughed without humor and said, "Never mind, because pride was just a word people use to polish failures." And I realized he carried a sorrow he could not name, and that he had chosen punishment, mine and his, over confession. Those moments did not absolve him, but they kept me from growing hard, kept me from turning him into a monster so cleanly drawn that I could ignore my own sorrow. And so I held them alongside the ugliness the way a man holds two heavy objects, one in each hand, feeling the arms burn and understanding that neither can be set down without consequence. The second escalation arrived at last, not as a crash, but as a long tightening, a drawn bowstring that hummed with strain. And it left the house in a hush so complete that even the neighborhood dogs seemed to lower their voices, because he had finally reached the place his pride had been steering him toward, the threshold where he could admit hunger or cling to power and starve. And he chose power. He locked the fridge one evening with a ceremonious little nod, as if pronouncing a verdict, patted his pocket for the key, and found it there, satisfied himself with the gesture of control, and then, with nothing left to eat and no one left to blame, who would listen? He poured himself a drink and called it dinner. I listened to the ice crack in the glass and thought of the atlas on the shelf, and the notes hidden inside, and the jar behind the furnace, and the peaches in the cellar, and the woman from the county office, and the neighbor's apples, and the long rope. Of small choices that had kept me alive for months, and I understood that we were no longer two men sharing a problem, but two men on separate paths, one spiraling inward toward a point he mistook for authority, the other stepping, however slowly, toward the air. I went to bed with a prayer that sounded more like a whisper to the dark, and when the morning came, I found him seated on the kitchen floor again. The lock, shining like a coin, dropped between us, his face ashen, his breath shallow, and his eyes fixed. On the door he had sealed with his own hands, and I knew the climax had moved into the house, not with noise, but with the austere certainty of a bill come due. It was the silence that struck me first, the kind of silence that does not belong in a house but in a church after the congregation has left, heavy and echoing, carrying with it the weight of absence. I woke before dawn, my mouth dry, my body aching with the stiffness of another night on the edge of sleep, and for a long moment I lay still, listening for the usual sounds, the shuffle of his feet in the hallway, the creak of the couch springs as he shifted restlessly in his half-sleep, the sudden clatter of a bottle tipped onto the floor. None of it came. The air felt dense, charged, and I knew something had reached its breaking point. I rose, steadied myself against the wall, and walked slowly down the hallway toward the kitchen, my heart hammering harder than I wished to admit for a man of my years. When I reached the doorway, I saw him seated on the floor again, slumped against the refrigerator as though it were a throne he could no longer hold upright upon. The padlock gleamed in the dim light, his hands limp at his sides, and his breath came shallow and uneven. His face was ashen, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes, Not the aggressive fear that lashes outward, but the hollow kind that comes when a body finally recognizes its own fragility. The key hung around his neck still, but his fingers seemed too weak to reach for it. He looked at me then, and for the briefest instant I thought he might ask for help, might extend the olive branch of desperation that would shatter the cruel theater he had maintained for months. Instead, he whispered, "You did this." The words dry and cracked, and I felt the weight of his accusation sink into me like a stone. I knelt beside him, the stiffness of my joints protesting, and I placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, Daniel," I said softly, "you did this to yourself." My voice surprised me with its steadiness, not angry, but firm, the voice of a teacher delivering the truth a student does not want to hear. His eyes flickered with something between rage and recognition, but the strength to respond had left him. He tried once more to push himself upright, his hand fumbling at the lock, and then he collapsed back, chest heaving, sweat gathering on his brow, though the room was cool. I stood torn between instincts that had defined me for decades. The father who wished to help his child, to lift him up, to feed and protect, and the man who had been humiliated, starved, stripped of dignity in his own home. The clash of those instincts was almost unbearable. In the corner of the kitchen, I saw the sack of apples the neighbor had given me, hidden away from my survival, and the thought came unbidden. I could take one now, bite into its sweetness, let him watch as I claimed the nourishment he had denied me. But even as the thought burned, I knew the gesture would be meaningless, a cruelty of my own that would do nothing to alter what was already written. The climax was not a battle of fists or shouts, but a battle of will, and in that moment I understood that the only way to reclaim what had been taken from me was not to fight him for the key, but to refuse the role he had written for me. I stepped back, leaning against the counter, and said quietly, "I will not beg any more." His head turned sharply, his eyes wide, as though those words wounded him more than any blow could. The power he had clung to had always depended on my submission, on my willingness to plead for scraps, and in refusing to continue the charade I had broken the fragile engine of his dominance. He tried to speak, his lips moving without sound, and then he clutched the chain around his neck, the key rattling faintly. He pulled once, twice, as if to remove it, but his strength failed him. I did not move forward. I did not take the key, though every instinct screamed at me to end the torment. Instead, I waited, my silence heavier than his own, and in that waiting something shifted. He slumped further, his chest rising in shallow jerks, and his gaze slipped from mine to the cold white surface of the fridge that had been his fortress. I do not know how long we stayed like that, the minutes stretching like hours, but at some point I realized that the decision had been made not by me, but by him, long before this night. In every choice he had made to tighten control rather than loosen it, to starve rather than share, to dominate rather than love. The lock had not been placed upon me, but upon himself, and the key he wore so proudly had become nothing more than a weight, dragging him down. I left him there and walked to my room, each step feeling like both defeat and liberation. I sat on the bed, listening to the silence settle again, thicker now, almost unbearable. And I thought of Martha, of the way she had always believed in redemption, in second chances, in forgiveness that stretched beyond reason. I wished, for her sake, that I could summon that same belief, but the truth was harder, sharper. Some locks are never meant to be opened, and some lessons are learned only too late. When I returned to the kitchen an hour later, the dawn had begun to push pale light through the window. Daniel was still there, slumped against the refrigerator, the key resting against his chest. His breath was slower now, weaker, and for a moment I thought he might slip away entirely. I knelt once more, not as a father hoping to save his son, but as a man witnessing the final toll of choices freely made. "You wanted me to earn my food," I whispered, "but you starved yourself instead." My words did not reach him. His eyes had closed, but I said them anyway, because they needed to be said, if only to the walls of the house that had seen it all. The climax was not in his collapse, nor in my endurance, but in the recognition that survival had never been about the lock or the key or the food inside the fridge. Survival had been about whether I would let his cruelty define me, whether I would allow his hunger for power to strip me of my humanity. And in that moment, though my heart broke with the sight of my son diminished, I knew I had not been destroyed. He had starved on his own pride, and I, despite all the suffering, remained. The house is quiet now in a way I had not experienced for many years, a quiet that does not oppress but releases, a silence that allows me to hear my own thoughts again without the constant weight of another man's anger pressing against them. In the days after that final night, when Daniel slumped against the refrigerator and let the key hang useless from his chest, I moved slowly through the rooms, reclaiming them piece by piece. At first, I did not know what to do with the sudden absence of his voice, the absence of the chains of control he had so carefully wrapped around my life. But as the hours passed, I realized that the absence itself was a gift, however painful the manner in which it had been delivered. The lock on the refrigerator was the first thing I removed, and when the door swung open to reveal its meager contents, I laughed softly to myself, not out of joy, but out of recognition. This door had been closed to me for so long, yet in the end it had never truly been closed, not to my will, not to my survival. It was only ever closed to him. The neighbors began to check on me more often once they realized Daniel was no longer around. Some of them asked gently where he had gone, and I gave them vague answers. He had moved on. He was seeking work. He had decided to try his luck elsewhere. I did not have the heart to speak the raw truth, not yet, and perhaps never in full detail. People want tidy explanations, and the truth of what had unfolded here was not tidy, but jagged, a story of pride and cruelty, and the slow erosion of love that no one wants to imagine could happen between a father and a son. I let them think what they wished, accepting their offers of food with gratitude, though I felt a pang each time I realized how easy it was for them to share what Daniel had guarded with such desperate selfishness. I returned to the church more regularly, and when I sat in the pews, I felt something loosen in me, a knot that had been tightening for years. I confessed quietly to the pastor not the full story, but enough of it, that he understood I had suffered, and he placed his hand on mine and told me that endurance was not the same as weakness, that sometimes survival itself was a victory. Those words lingered in me, and though they did not erase the sorrow, they allowed me to walk home with a steadier step. At night, I often found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator, still half expecting to see the gleam of the lock, or to hear Daniel's footsteps approaching, to remind me that I owed him for every scrap I took. But the lock was gone, the chain was gone, and the silence was mine. I stocked the shelves, slowly, carefully, not with extravagance, but with enough to live on, bread and cheese, fruit and milk, simple things that carried with them no humiliation. Each time I opened the door, I felt the weight of memory, but I also felt the strength of having endured, of knowing that he had tried to bend me into dependence, and yet I had found ways to remain myself. There are days when guilt settles on me, heavy and inescapable, because a part of me still whispers that I should have saved him, that I should have forced the key from his hand and opened the door for him, that I should have found some way to rescue the boy I once held, no matter how cruel the man he had become. But when those thoughts press too hard, I remind myself that salvation cannot be stolen from another's will, that he had every chance to turn back, to loosen the grip of pride, to accept the simple truth that love is not measured in control. He chose otherwise, and his choice consumed him. In the mornings, I drink my tea by the window and watch the world go about its business. The mailman comes, children walk to school, neighbors trim their hedges, and life continues with its indifferent rhythm. I find comfort in that ordinariness, in knowing that my story, however sharp and cruel its edges, is folded into the larger fabric of days that rise and fall. I tend my garden again, and when the tomatoes ripen, I will share them with the neighbors, because I know now more than ever that to hoard is to starve, not only the body, but the soul. The final reckoning between Daniel and me does not exist in words spoken aloud, for there will be no reconciliation across the table, no apologies, no embraces. It exists only in the lessons etched into my bones, that love offered can be twisted into a weapon, that trust can be broken by those you thought closest, and yet that survival is possible even in the shadow of betrayal. I live now with a quieter dignity, one earned not by triumph but by endurance, and though the house carries scars, it also carries the proof that I remain. When I close my eyes at night, I sometimes see him as he was in his last moments, slumped against the fridge, still clutching the key that had become his undoing. But more often I see him as a child again, laughing with jam on his cheeks, chasing bubbles through the kitchen, unaware of the future that would twist between us. I hold both images, the child and the man, because both are true, and to deny either would be to lie about the complexity of love. That is the resolution I have come to. Not neat, not happy, but real. He locked the fridge and demanded I earn my food, but in the end, it was he who starved, and I who learned that survival is not only about bread or apples or jars hidden in the cellar, but about refusing to surrender the core of who I am. No matter how tightly the lock is fastened,